Hi, this is Joe Hage. As of this recording, we have 296,000 members worldwide. And one of the reasons the group continues to flourish is because we have members like Jon Speer, who is the founder of Greenlight.guru, and he is going to share with us information about changes in ISO 1345. Hello, Jon.
Hi, Joe. How are you?
Good, thank you. Now, Jon is going to show a picture of himself in slide 2, I think, and it is false advertising, because at the end of this presentation, he's going to show another picture of himself where he's got this amazing beard. But enough about that. You'll have to stay to the end for that. And, Jon, I'll mute myself, and you can get going, okay?
All right, great. Thanks for the intro, Joe.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It sounds like we have people from all over the world today joining us for this presentation that we have to share on risk management for medical devices. Today we've got quite a bit to cover, so I'm going to skip a little bit of the details on the background. I'll just give you enough to let you know that I've been in this industry since 1998, served in various capacities from product development engineering to quality manager to regulatory affairs, and running my own consulting practice and so on. And about 2 years ago, I had this wonderful idea to change the medical device world forever, and we started a new company called greenlight.guru. And greenlight.guru is a platform solution provider, and we help make medical device product development much simpler. We improve your efficiency. We help you get to market faster while improving your regulatory compliance. And we're going to get into that as well as we go through the presentation. But today I'm going to talk about, the primary topic is ISO 14971. We're going to dive into the details of risk management. I'm going to also hit on some of the things that are changing in the regulatory world with respect to the topic of risk as well. Whether you know it or not, the world before us right now and the medical device industry is quickly moving toward a risk-based approach. And that's evident with what's been happening with the most recent revision of ISO 1345. So we're going to dive into a lot of these things. As always, when you're participating in these webinars, if you have any questions, please be sure to type those in. Mentioned on the onset, we will get to those, time permitting, as quickly as possible toward the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm just going to dive in. So some of this is probably review for many of you, looking at the attendee list. I know many of you are in the industry, so I'm not going to dwell on reading through every single definition in ISO 14971. I do encourage you, if you do not have that standard, that's something that you need to get your hands on. And it doesn't matter if you're in Europe or United States or Canada or Australia, or I think I heard there were some people from Qatar as well. It is evident that what's happening in the regulatory environment is 14971 is emerging very quickly as the key standard that will drive the medical device industry, not only from a product development standpoint, but also from a quality system standpoint, and we're going to dive into that. Some key definitions that I think that are important for you to understand is that definition of risk. Risk is the combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. You have to know that definition because that is key and influential as you go through all of your risk management activities, bringing new products to market, dealing with complaints, CAPAs, and other post-market issues. You have to have a clear definition of that term risk. A few other definitions that are important, and as we get into the process, these will become a little bit more relevant. Things like risk analysis, risk estimation, risk evaluation, risk assessment, risk control. I mean, we're going to hear the word risk a lot of times today, and I think that if you've been to any medical device industry conference in the past 3 to 6 months, you probably have noticed that that's a recurring theme. The word risk is thrown around like crazy these days, so it's important to understand the context of all these different variations of risk. What is a risk analysis? What is a risk assessment? What is risk management, and so on and so forth. It's very important because sometimes when you get into the regulations, like for example, if you look at the FDA, the only spot in the FDA regulations where they even mention anything along the lines of terms related to risk is in design validation as part of the design control regulations in 82030. And it makes reference to risk analysis. Now keep in mind that those regulations were introduced into the market back in, I think, 1996. So a lot has changed from then until now, and FDA has made itself very clear multiple occasions and throughout the preamble to the regulations that what they mean when they say risk analysis is risk management. And while they don't come out and say you must follow 14971, FDA is very clear and says 14971 is a harmonized standard and we endorse it. So you might as well follow it. And that's the same case regardless of where you are in the world. And we'll dive in here in a few moments about some of the variations between ISO 14971 2007 and EN ISO 14971 2012. So let's just get right into it. I'm going to go through kind of a high-level overview of 14971. I think it's important for you to know the gist of what that standard covers. It covers things like risk management planning, risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk controls, overall residual risk acceptability. It defines the criteria for what needs to be in a risk management report. It defines what you need to do from a production and a post-production standpoint, and it also defines what is involved in a risk management file. So it's very important. The first piece here is a risk management plan. So anytime you are to start a new development project, or you've got something that you've already launched into the marketplace and now you need to update that particular risk management plan for that particular product, it's very important to understand what needs to go into a risk management plan. First and foremost, one of the things that you need to understand is intended use. And I'm going to speak a little bit here in a few moments about the relationship between design controls and risk management. But I think you all, if you've been through medical device product development, you will all understand that the importance of that term intended use. That term intended use is very critical when it comes to product classification with FDA, with European competent authorities, with Health Canada, and other parts of the world. It's all based on what the intended use of your product is. Well, it's also very, very important from a risk management perspective, and you need to define that as part of your plan. The other important concepts of a risk management plan is that you're going to identify the risk management activities that you have planned throughout the entire product life cycle. Now, note product life cycle, that's the key phrase in that point there. It's not just about the risk management activities that are happening during design and development. It's out throughout the entire product life cycle, through development, post-production, and so on. And also an important part of a risk management plan is that you need to identify who's involved, what are the roles and responsibilities, who is the team that is going to be involved in reviewing the risk management plan and risk management activities throughout the entire product life cycle. Here's a biggie. The big part of the risk management plan is defining the risk acceptability. Now, I know a lot of times you may have a procedure that's implemented in your company that if you're following 1345 or FDA's quality system regulations or other quality system criteria, chances are you have a risk management procedure, and that risk management procedure likely defines the criteria for risk acceptability. But it's also important that that is included within your risk management plan. You have to define when something is acceptable and when something is unacceptable. And as we go through this conversation and webinar today, I'm going to hit on some of the key differences between ISO 14971 2007 version and also the EN ISO 14971 2012 version. And here's an important point right now, and that has to do with acceptability. So if you're following along with maybe you don't know the difference, so I'll give you a brief overview. So basically, a few years ago, EN ISO 14971 2012 was introduced into Europe as an attempt to basically better align with the medical device directives in Europe. And there were meat of the standard, or the normative part of the standard, did not change. The only thing that did change in the 2012 version was the addition of 3 Z annexes. And within those annexes, it defines some specific details. And I'm going to hit on those as I go through the presentation today. One of the points in one of these Z annexes is this concept of risk acceptability. Always before, in the 2007 version and so on, there was kind of this accepted concept that you had the acceptable region from a risk acceptability, you had the unacceptable region, and then you had this kind of middle zone that many refer to as ALARP, or as low as reasonably practicable. that concept with the 2012, the European version of the standard, really went away, and now the expectation is that you're reducing risk as far as possible, regardless of where it stands. So that's really important to define within your risk management plan and also within your risk management procedures, especially if you're pursuing products in the European market. You also need to define in your plan risk control measures. You need to basically make sure that you're verifying those things and that they're effective. And then you also need to define what happens after you launch your product into the market and you're dealing with production and post-production issues. Like, how is that information going to be gathered so that you can continually update the risk management activities throughout the entire product lifecycle? I mean, are you going to leverage complaints, or are you going to go look at complaint databases and things like FDA mod and adverse events and vigilance reporting? Those are all things that you need to define within your risk management plan. All right, so I've been talking really fast right now, but I want to pause for a moment, give you all a chance to take advantage of our free offer that we're providing right now. And that free offer is you can get a risk management plan template, and all you have to do is go to the URL that's listed on the screen, greenlight.guru/risk-webinar-offer. It's really free. All you have to do is go to that website, click the link, and you can download that file right away. All right, so I had hit on a few minutes ago the importance of the risk acceptability matrix, and I want to dive into that a little bit. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I'm a co-founder of greenlight.guru. We are a software solution provider for the medical device industry. One of the things that we just rolled out just a few weeks ago is a risk management feature set. And yes, that risk management feature set does follow ISO 14971, even if you're going along with the 2007 version, or if you're following the EN ISO 14971 2012. It accommodates both versions. But risk acceptability matrix, this is one of those things where if you go back to the definition that I hit on about risk, probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of harm. This is a very routine way to define risk acceptability, where you have severity on one axis and you have your probability on the other axis. And the terms and definitions that you have for each of these scales that should align with the type of product you have and be commensurate with what's expected to happen for the different things with your particular products. So you can see probability, you want to define different levels, and these scales, they can be adjustable, and like within Greenlight, we give you options. You can make a 3x3 matrix, you can make a 4x4 or 5x5, but it's really up to you to define what those different levels are. My word of caution for you is to keep it as simple as you possibly can. Sometimes people want to go to 10-point scales where they'll have 10 different choices for severity and 10 different choices for probability. And I've lived in those kind of environments where that's what we had in place from a risk management standpoint. But I do caution you to not have too many choices, because it can get very confusing. Keep it as simple as you possibly can. But you can see here within a risk acceptability matrix, you need to define where things are acceptable, where things are unacceptable, and what requires a risk-benefit analysis. So you'll see the RBA acronym, that's reference to risk-benefit analysis.
John, it's Joe. I'm going to interject. If you go back to the last slide, my friend Jim asks, how might a matrix like this be for a software-only device?
Joe, I missed a couple words. Do you mind repeating the question?
Of course. How might a matrix like this be for a software-only device?
Okay, that's a great question. A software-only device, I mean, if the software is still used as a med device, it's still important to identify the risk associated with that particular medical device. Again, we've got two scales here. We've got the probability and we've got the severity. So if that software were to fail, what would the severity of that be? Would it cause death, or would it cause serious injury, or would it just be a nuisance? And those are typically things that you would define as part of your severity scale. And then as far as the probability, oftentimes, probability, occurrence, likelihood. No, I'm not a statistician, so don't judge my blending of these terms. But oftentimes in the industry, we use probability, likelihood, and occurrence interchangeably. And from a software standpoint, if you look at a particular hazard, hazard is a potential source of harm. If you look at how often that happens, then that can help you identify from a probability standpoint. So risk management, 14971 risk management especially, really not specific to whether your medical device is software or hardware, mechanical, electrical, or anything. It doesn't dictate. It's for all medical devices. Okay, so now this is I want to hit into some of the more details. We're going to start diving into some of the process. So far, we've kind of stayed at the 30,000 foot view, but now we're going to drill down into a few more of the details. This particular image that I'm sharing with you right now, this comes straight from the standard. It does say ISO 14971-2007. Note that this is the same figure that is also in the 2012 version. Remember, there is no difference between the normative part of the standard. The only thing that's different between 2007 and 2012 are the particular annexes that support the interpretation of the standard. But as you can see, from this chart, there's kind of three or four or five main chunks, I guess, not 3, 4, 5. But so we got risk analysis and risk evaluation. So those two things make up what's commonly referred to as risk assessment. And I reminded you earlier that there are some important terms and definitions, and this is where all these terms sometimes get used interchangeably. I mean, sometimes somebody says risk analysis, and what they mean is risk assessment, and sometimes somebody says risk control, and what they mean is risk management, and so on. So these really get mixed up a lot. So it's very, very important that when somebody uses the term that you understand exactly how they use it, and I would encourage you to all within your organization start to adopt the common terminology that is defined within 14971. If you don't do it, keep in mind that the regulatory agencies, FDA and others, they are using the terminology in 14971. So they may say to you, show me your risk management report, and you may send them a risk assessment, and they're going to be asking you all kinds of questions about the information that is missing because they asked for something different than what you provided them. So the terminology is very, very important. So after you do a risk evaluation, then the next big chunk is risk control. And it's interesting. I'm going to describe this in a very linear process, and it's just like design controls and product development and so on. It's always described in a straight line, but it seldom happens in a linear fashion. So it's very important to understand that there is some hierarchy that is expected, but it's important that you capture all of these different parts and pieces from a risk management standpoint. And going in a straight line doesn't always make sense. So once you have risk control, then risk control really is about reducing the risk that is evident as part of your product. And we're going to talk about this here in a few moments, but it's very important for your risk management and your design control efforts to be in sync with one another. In fact, I might even postulate that those are two slightly different perspectives of the exact same process. And I'll dive into that here in a few slides. But risk control is about reducing the risk. Once you've done that, then you need to evaluate the overall residual risk acceptability, and that's for the entire product. So up until this point, what you've looked at is individual risk associated with particular hazards and hazardous situation. And now at this stage, you're looking at all of these things together, the entire device in its entirety, and determining if the overall residual risks are acceptable or not. You define all of these details on a wonderful risk management report, and then from there, you're continuing to monitor, manage, mitigate, address any risk from a production and a post-production standpoint once you've launched into the manufacturing and sales of your product. This chart's a little busy. Don't worry about reading every single block in this particular view. I'm going to break it down into digestible chunks here in the next few moments. But this also comes from the standard. I encourage you to not reinvent the wheel. Many people, when it comes to risk management, they think that they have a wonderful approach and idea, and you might be right. But I would encourage you to, as best and as quickly as possible, to start adopting what's defined within 14971, and not just regurgitate what's stated in the standard, but put it to practice, put it to use. Make sure you understand what all of these steps mean and interpret how your organization is going to follow these things. the more in alignment you can be from a 14971 standpoint. It's really going to make not only your product development life easier, but also your quality system life easier, especially with the coming changes of ISO 1345. So let's dive into some of the details. I'm going to spend first a few moments on risk assessment. And remember, risk assessment is a combination of risk analysis and risk evaluation. And I like to bundle these things together because there's a natural flow. If you think about when you start a project, and remember when we defined our risk management plan, we're identifying the intended use of that particular product. And as part of the intended use is how is your product going to be used? What are you going to market it as, and so on. And as part of your risk analysis, you need to identify what are foreseeable hazards. What are things, and hazards are a potential source of harm. So what are all the hazards that can happen for your particular product? Now, a lot of people, I'm going to say right now, they misuse this risk assessment. One of the things that a lot of people are doing for risk assessment is they're doing an FMEA, and while you may have FMEA in use at your organization, and I'll just remind you, FMEA, failure mode effects analysis. FMEA is not risk management. Now, FMEA is a good tool for reliability, but FMEA evaluates failures. What happens if something breaks? Now, this is another key point where the term matters. The definition for hazard is a potential source of harm. It doesn't say that something had to break for it to be a source of harm. You can use a medical device entirely correctly, and there will still be hazards. FMEA is about when something breaks. It's a single fault failure. So that would imply something doesn't happen the way it's supposed to. This is one of the flaws of using FMEA and saying that you're following 14971. But after you've identified the foreseeable hazards, you need to estimate the risk for those hazardous situations. And remember, risk is the combination of probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. And that's why that matrix that we showed just a few slides ago with severity on the x-axis, a probability on the y, this is where you start to estimate that. And then from there, you need to determine whether or not risk reduction is required. And this is when you define where those acceptable regions are. Now, if you're operating in an EN ISO 14971-2012 environment, all risks, regardless of where they are reduction is required. Now, if you're in a 2007 world, as far as the standard is concerned, you need to define where the acceptable region is, the ALARP region is, and the unacceptable region, and determine what to do next based on your definition of what is acceptable from a risk standpoint. Now we're going to dive into risk control, and all I've done is that I've split out the different sections of that busy chart that I showed you a couple slides ago into the digestible chunks. So at this point, we've made a decision whether or not risk reduction is required. And the way we're going to reduce our risk is we're going to identify these things known as risk controls or risk control measures. Some people refer to these as risk mitigations or something along those lines. Again, I encourage you, I actually beg you, please follow the terminology that's in the standard. As long as you're all speaking the same language, it's going to make life a lot easier on this topic of risk. But you identify those risk control measures. It can be things like you have to do a specific test. Maybe you have to update a particular design input. And this is another key point where risk management ties into design controls. Things like design outputs and design verification and design validation activities, those are all very good candidates for risk control measures. So keep that in mind. There is a tie into the design control side of things. Once you've done that, identify what your risk control measures are, then you need to determine if you can actually reduce the risk. And if the answer to that question is no, then here's a concept known as risk-benefit analysis. You have an opportunity. You can say, I can't reduce my risk any further, but now you can evaluate the medical benefits that your product provides to the patient versus the risk that it poses. And if you have a rationale to support that decision, and your organization is willing to accept the risk associated with making that decision, then you have the opportunity to document this as a risk-benefit analysis. And here's another point where the two versions of the standard are different. I want to highlight that. The 2012, the European version of 14971, it requires that you do a risk-benefit analysis for every single risk. It doesn't matter if your risk is determined to be acceptable, if it's reduced as far as possible, or what have you. You have to do a risk-benefit analysis for every single item. All right, so let's go back to our flow chart, kind of keep walking through that and see how things are going here. So risk reducible, if the answer to that is yes, then you need to implement those risk control measures, and then you need to make sure that you verified that those risk control measures are appropriate and are actually doing what you said that they were going to do from a risk reduction standpoint. And then from there, you're going to look at the residual risk. You're going to evaluate that severity. You're going to evaluate that probability again. And then it's possible when you implement risk control measures that you have possibly introduced new hazards or hazardous situations. So if that happens, then you need to basically go through that process again. You need to identify hazards for those new things that came up, and you need to take it through the same rigorous process that we're going through. And then once you've confirmed that all hazards are identified, then you get to go to that next major step of the risk management process. Before I get to that, I want to remind you a little bit more about what a risk-benefit analysis is. This is an important concept, and the big important part of this is because of what came out in the European version of the standard a few years ago, and requiring every risk have a risk-benefit analysis. And again, you're just going to weigh the medical benefits that your product provides versus the risks that are posed right now. So that's an important thing to realize. All right, so after you've done your risk controls, now you need to do an overall residual risk evaluation. Up until this point, we've looked at individual hazards and the risk associated with that. Now we're looking at the entire finished product and determining whether or not that is acceptable or not. So you need to, again, you'll see that concept of risk-benefit analysis. That's why I wanted to hit on that specifically a couple of times. That's going to come in, again, at the end here where you're looking at the overall product. You need to, once again, determine how that risk-benefit fits into the whole equation. Once everything has been reduced and acceptable, and or you have a RBA, a risk-benefit analysis, now it's time to finalize that risk management report. All right, so in that report, some specific details that you need to capture. You want to hit all those risk-benefit analysis. You want to make sure that you've addressed all the risk acceptability for your product. You want to make sure that all the activities that you identified in your risk management plan have in fact been addressed and captured and so on. And you also want to make sure that you have the right resources within your organization. Generally, it's somebody pretty high up the food chain. Smaller organizations, it's probably going to be the CEO, but somebody who has the authority, the executive responsibility within the organization to basically review and approve and accept the risks that are identified in that particular report. And then the last big part of the continuing product lifecycle process that risk management has to do with production and post-production information. Want to make sure that you have the processes in place that can feed into your risk management for your particular product after you've launched into the marketplace. And it's things like making sure your CAPA process can feed into your risk management, and that your complaint process can feed into your management, that customer feedback feeds back in, and all of these other things that you're using on a day-to-day basis as part of your quality management system. They all need to feed back into the product lifecycle process for risk. And as I get jumping the gun a little bit, but here in a few slides I'm going to talk to you about what's happening in 1345 and why this concept of a lifecycle process with respect to risk is not only important for your product development, design, manufacturing efforts, it's also going to be important for your quality management system efforts as well. Okay, I've hit on a few points where ISO 14971 2007 and Ian ISO 14971 2012, there's some variation between these two things. I'm going to spend a moment or two kind of reviewing those particular differences. I know I added those in the context as we were going through different topics, but I want to to give you a moment to sort of absorb what those things are. And I'm not going to go through every single nook and cranny, nut and bolt detail of all the nuances. Just know that if you want some entertaining reading for a couple of days, just go to Joe Hage, as you all know, as part of the Medical Devices Group on LinkedIn. There's oftentimes there will be a discussion about risk management on either the main Medical Devices Group or some of the subgroups. Like it's common in the QA and RA group that there will be a risk management discussion. But there's some lively reading on this topic. There's a lot of debate. A lot of people are very passionate and adamant about what is and is not required from a risk management standpoint. But just, if you have any doubts at all, you can always reach out to me, and I will be sure to help point you in the right direction. If I can't answer your question, I know the 3 people who can.
Thanks for the plug, John. I'll put a link to the QARA group for everyone. I've already added a link to the webinar offer you made, and I am getting your slides up live on the website. You have quite a queue of questions here, so let me know when you want to take a break for some of those early ones.
How about let's go ahead and hit a couple of questions now, Joe.
Okay, I'll do it. Let's see. Mark asks, is the new module able to accommodate strictly quantitative risk management processes?
I'm not sure I know exactly what Mark is meaning by that. I think I know who Mark is, though. That's the interesting thing is, Joe, because he sent me an email the other day. But the way we set up the risk module in greenlight.guru is we allow you to define the scales for probability, and we allow you to define the scales that you have for severity as well. If you want some recommendations, we have some default descriptions for each of those probability and severity scales out of the box.
Okay.
But it's a fairly standard approach.
He adds that the latest version of the standard from ISO is 2007. The English version, or the EN version, 2012 has not been released by ISO, which you probably know, but I'm reading it aloud for everyone's benefit.
Right. The standard is known as EN ISO. It's not released throughout the entire world. It is a European-only version. You can only get that standard through organizations like BSI, and there are a few others.
Maya asks, she always has a problem defining probability. How do you define probability?
Well, probability it's always a difficult scale to define. Oftentimes there is an implication that there's some sort of rate or occurrence that is defined or tied to probability. And when you're a brand new, you got a brand new device that there's nothing like it in the market, it's really hard to determine how you could have 1 in a million chance. So a more common practice that's used is try to tie in some qualitative descriptions. And I think if you can use some agreed upon within your organization, some descriptions that make sense, then and assign those particular levels, that's going to be really important within the organization. If somebody wants to have be able to quantify that probability scale, then you're going to have some sort of supporting evidence for the values that you estimate for probability. And you've got a brand new device, you can rely on history of use of maybe competitive or predicate devices that might be in the market. You may be able to search things like the MAUDE database from FDA and other vigilance reporting channels that exist to try to determine that. But it really is really difficult, and I wish I had a better answer than that. But that's why it's very important when you go through risk management that it's not a solo activity, that you have a team representing the various functions within your organization participating in the event. It's good to have sort of voice of customer. If you can get end users participating in that's important too. But realize that when it comes to probability, it's the probability of occurrence of harm. It's not just the probability of occurrence. And
let me build on that with Dan's question, and then one more, and then I'll let you return. Dan writes, I'm used to risk-based analysis being an analysis of the overall product. Are you saying that the analysis needs to be done for each line item? Hazard plus hazardous situation equals harm?
Yeah, I mean, if you take a literal interpretation of the standard, it's very clear that you need to estimate the risk for each hazard and hazardous situation. And again, risk is defined as the probability of occurrence plus the severity, or the probability of occurrence of harm plus the severity of that harm. So, if you're, like I said, if you're following the standard literally, then the expectation is that you're identifying risk for every single hazard and hazardous situation.
And then a number of questions having to do with FMEA. One writes, the matrix is typical for FMEA but not for other models. That's from Robin. Jason says, can you specify the difference between risk management and FMEA processes that use similar risk charts? So a couple things, and then here's a third. Sebastian, if not using FMEA, how do you objectively quantify risks during assessment and then enter into the matrix?
All good concepts, and I think I can sum it up with a couple of statements. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, FMEA, it's a good tool, but FMEA assumes that something bad happened, that there was a failure. If you're taking FMEA literal, FMEA includes, there's a lot of terminology confusion between FMEA and ISO 14971, but FMEA includes things like failure modes, causes of failure, severity, occurrence, detection, and I think that that's one of the big differences from FMEA and ISO 14971 standpoint. It's really about FMEA is a failure mode tool. It assumes that there's something broke and now you need to determine what caused that and what is the severity, occurrence, detection, and usually what's calculated from that is what's known as a risk priority number. The most common practice for an FMEA is to multiply those three terms. And if we go back to 14971, the definition of risk, there's nothing about detection in the definition of risk. It is the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that. It's the combination of those two things. And again, risk management is your product can be used exactly as you, well, basically what I said in that last minute is FMEA is what happens when stuff fails, and risk management is what happens when stuff is medical devices are used. You can have hazards and your product is used correctly. FMEA only.
So in the meanwhile, I am going to entertain the troops with a link to the QAR Group, which I've now put out there for the entire audience. This is, please sing, thank you, Susan. Thank you very much. I sent a link out to the QAR Group for folks.
All right, Joe, can you hear me now?
I can. Are you on the phone?
No, I'm on Nick's computer.
Okay. Well, someone might want to dial up just in case. But I'll go back on mute, and why don't we resume the presentation where you are. Thank you, John.
All right. Sounds great. All right, so let's spend a little bit of time talking about risk management and the relationship between risk management and design controls. Right now, we've talked a little bit about intended use and the importance of intended use with respect to design controls and also from risk management standpoint. It's an important piece because risk or intended use defines how your product's going to be used. It's important because it defines how your product is going to be cleared from a regulatory perspective as well. So I want to show you a chart here that dives into, this is kind of a flow, if you will. I know there were some questions about how do you flow from through a risk management process and what are the various steps. And we kind of hit on that earlier from a 14971 standpoint. But this is kind of a slightly different view of that. And I've shown in here a couple of spots where design controls tie in. So moving from left to right and throughout the entire process, I want to show you how risk management and design controls, they really are the same process but from slightly different perspectives. Both design control and risk management are intended to do one simple thing, in my opinion. And that one simple thing, I mean, it's not really simple, of course, but that one simple thing is to prove your medical device is safe and effective for the intended use. That's really what you're trying to do from design control, and that's really what you're trying to do from a risk management standpoint. So we have to realize these have very, very similar intent behind them. But moving through this flow, you can identify the hazard and hazardous situations, and then from there there's a tie-in at that point to that different design controls. So things like user needs and design inputs, there's a relationship between hazards, hazardous situations, user needs, and design inputs. From there you identify foreseeable events that could that lead up to a hazardous situation. You define the particular harm, what could happen, and what is the source. And you can see through this flow that there's just, this aligns with your product development process, or it should align with your product development process. You identify the probability of severity of that harm. You estimate the level of risk. Is it acceptable, unacceptable, and so on. You go through the risk control. I mean, again, this is stuff we've already talked about from earlier slide. When you get into risk control measures, this is where you start to identify things like design outputs and design verification and design validation. These are all design control activities. And of course, there could be other risk control measures, but there is a direct linkage to design control and risk management. In fact, I was in an ISO surveillance audit about 6 months ago, and the auditor, in this case, she wanted to see our design control activities. She wanted to look at the user needs, the inputs, the outputs, and so on. And then she shifted over and she said, all right, now show me your risk management. And so we pulled up our risk management file. And then she says, well, why aren't these two things integrated? And I'm like, well, they're separate. She's like, no, you have that all wrong. They are entirely the same. You need to make sure that these things dovetail together. And I think that's very important for industry to understand right now. The regulatory world, this was an ISO audit, and I've heard it come from FDA, and it's going to be more evident as the new 1345 rolls out. The expectation is that risk and design, they're really the same process. It's like two different sides of the same coin. It's very, very important. But you can see how that kind of flows through. Just a few more points about that. We already talked about the intended use, how important that is between both risk and design. We talked about risk management being a total product lifecycle process. Well, guess what? So is product development. There's the design control piece that happens to bring a new product to market, but then once you've launched into the market, now you have things like change control and managing your device master record and complaints and CAPAs. Well, guess what? Those all feed back into your design control process. So both design control, risk need to be handled as product lifecycle processes. Also very, very important that we start shifting towards using risk management as a tool. I've seen some cases throughout my career where maybe risk management wasn't treated as a tool. I've seen plenty of cases where risk management was treated as a checkbox activity, but I'm here to tell you that risk management is not a checkbox activity. Now, I can share a short story. I was a young engineer. I think I was 23, maybe 24. I was working on one of my first medical device projects. I had gone through design controls, documented my design and development plan, all of my inputs and outputs and verification activities, and I was approaching the point where I wanted to transfer into production. And then I had an oh crap moment. I said, oh crap, I haven't done my risk management activities yet. So I went and spent the next few hours at my desk, and I created my risk management documentation, and I did it all by myself, and I got it all done in the course of a couple of hours. And I was proud that I got my risk management activities done. But the problem is it didn't add any value. Risk management is supposed to help you improve the safety and the effectiveness of your medical device. And I learned pretty quickly that it really did suck to spend a few hours doing an activity just to check a box. But I got to check the box, but that was the last time that I ever treated risk management that way. And I hope you're not treating your risk management process that way either. It's very important, too, that in addition to what you're looking at from a risk management standpoint as you're going through design and development and the manufacturing of your products. Other people will be evaluating the decisions that you make from a risk management standpoint as well. Whether you're ISO certified or you're registered with the FDA or some other regulatory body, there's a good chance that there's going to be inspectors and auditors coming in, whether it might even be a supplier or coming in to evaluate your processes and doing audits and inspections. And guess what? They're going to look at your risk management documentation. Hopefully you have it. And they're going to maybe challenge you and make sure that when you went through that process that you understood the value of being thorough and complete with risk management and not just checking a box on your form and saying that you got something done. So now let's spend the next several minutes talking about what's about to happen with 1345. You'll notice that the nomenclature here includes an X as far as the year is concerned. I saw that recently as this is it's an unknown. It's not entirely clear when the new version of 1345 is going to go live. Most signs are pointing to 2016. The current version is been published since 2003. So the way standards work is usually every 5 to 7 years they roll out and they get updated. So the 1345, frankly, is long overdue for an update. Now I've done some analysis of the 1345 2001X, and there are a few, I would guess, I'll put them in the category of major changes. The big adjustment here for 1345 is this concept of risk. I mean, I've only said risk probably 122 times so far in this webinar, but I've already hit on what's happening from the FDA perspective and EU perspective. Well, guess what? 1345 is also evolving to be a risk-based approach, and not only from a product standpoint, but also from a quality management system standpoint. It uses the premise and the foundation that's been laid by by ISO 14971, and just continues to build upon that. And I think that's really, really important for you to understand is the risk-based approach is now going to start getting into different aspects of your business rather than just the product development and manufacturing efforts that you have underway. But some of the big areas where that's the major changes from a 1345 standpoint and the next version are things like regulatory requirements. And I would say that's probably the biggest driver towards this new revision. Keep in mind the current published version has only been out, or has been out since 2003. If you think about your time in the medical device industry and the regulatory environment, I can speak for myself anyway, a great deal has changed in the regulatory environment since 2003. And frankly, the standard 1345 is really out of date in some respects with what's happening from a regulatory perspective. So there needs to be some catch-up work. And that's really what's driving a lot of this changes. But there's an expectation that throughout different processes in your quality system, things like purchasing and suppliers, that you're actually evaluating the ability of your resources to deliver products and components and services and so on that will allow you to design, manufacture safe and effective medical devices. So that's really, really important part of this new version of 1345. Some other details that you should be aware of, the term risk and regulatory and the current version of ISO 1345 2003. It's mentioned some 50 times. I think that it balloons to well over 200 times in the draft version that's scheduled for release probably in 2016. I already hit on some of the regulations, better alignment with regulations, but also a lot's changed in the industry as well. So the 1345 revision is going to better align with some of the industry best practices. And again, this concept of risk-based QMS, that's now going to be ingrained throughout. The other big shift here is already happened actually. The 9001 and 1345, both of those standards used to be in alignment. And both of those were scheduled to be revised in a similar time frame. It's two different groups that are working on these different standards. But the 9001 version has actually already been published, and it's going in a pretty different direction from what we've seen so far from the draft 1345. So that's important. So sometimes contract manufacturers who've carried dual registrations, it's been pretty easy up until this point with 9001, 1345. That will become a bit of a challenge from this point going forward. A few other details that are important to realize about the changes. It's just giving some more flexibility. You have an opportunity to identify different parts of the standard that maybe are non-applications, depending on better align with like design firms and contract manufacturers and other service providers. They may not be entirely applicable across the entire standard, but there might be some clauses where they are applicable, so that just gives a lot more flexibility. And just a couple other terminology changes that you should be aware of. Things like product quality. Well, that's now referred to as product safety and performance. Again, the concept of risk is pervasive throughout this standard. But anyway, that kind of hits on a lot of the details of some of this, but it's important for you to think about, oh, I guess I have one more. The other things that have changed, again, this is more of a regulatory, things like UDI, the unique device identification. There's been a lot of movement since the current version of 1345 has been published. So there's some criteria in 1345, the new version, that aligns with the way that's moving as well. But also some more emphasis on design and development activities, especially when it comes to transferring to production. Keep in mind that risk management and design controls, those are product lifecycle processes, so it doesn't stop once you transfer to production. So ISO 1345, they recognize that, and they're making some adjustments to that as well. It's important to think about what is the impact of this standard and how is this going to affect you. I think the good news here is that if you already have 1345 in place and or are compliant with FDA quality system regulations, I think the overall impact will be fairly minor. I think that assumes that you're starting to move towards more of a risk-based approach, but you really need to emphasize and stress the importance of 14971. That is, as far as I'm concerned, the best standard there is in our industry. It's prescriptive enough, and it provides ample detail to help guide you through what is expected from a risk management standpoint. And the good news is I happen to know of a software solution provider known as greenlight.guru that has the only ISO 14971 software solution on the market today, and it's the only software solution that exists that integrates design control and risk management as one seamless process. So if those things are important to you, I'll let you know how to get a hold of me once again here in a few moments. But the overall impact of this new standard I think it's going to be slight. It's expected to be published in 2016, and there'll be a three-year adoption period, which is already that's a pretty standard approach for standards like this. Just a couple thoughts on a risk-based quality management system. What does that mean? Well, here's how that is impacted. I mean, things like management review and training and calibration and purchasing and all these other quality management system elements. The expectation is that throughout those processes that you're actually using risk-based decision-making process, like in a management review. What happens if something fails? What is the impact? What does that mean? Does that mean you have to go redesign a product? Does that mean you have to do a recall and so on? So it's really applying that risk thinking to your overall business processes. Last thing I want to share, as I mentioned, if you're at all interested in getting a software solution that aligns with 14971, either the 2007 or 2012 version, the only one on the market, frankly, that also integrates with design and development, then here's how you find out more information about Greenlight software. So I appreciate your attention today. Joe, I think we have time for a few more questions.
Well, so yes, we do. Just 4 minutes to the top of the hour. We will continue to record. We will be asking these questions, and we will record them. So if you have to drop off, we understand, but we will continue. I just shared a link to today's slides in the chat box, so you should be able to click through for that. And it also has a link to the free risk management template download. I guess my first question is for the world. Do you guys prefer John with the big beard or the small beard? That's a personal question. You're welcome to write your answer in the chat box.
And Joe, this is a picture of our Greenlight management team. You notice it's a lot of old white guys, but we've all been around the block before. We've all been in startups, and we know what we're doing. So we've got a kick-ass team behind us that is developing the best software known to man, and it's like no experience I've ever been a part of.
Well, Bill wants you to discuss documentation of risk management within the context of post-release engineering change.
I love these risk questions. They're very deep. All right, so Bill, as far as post-production documentation, there's the current practices that I've seen in a lot of companies right now is that on things like CAPAs and complaints and some of these post-market processes, there's usually a section on like a CAPA form or a section on a complaint form that says something like, hey, did you update your risk management? And yes or no, and if no, provide justification. That really is, that's an archaic practice. Really what you need to have is a risk management file that is living and have the ability that when you get a complaint or a CAPA or nonconformance or some post-production event that you're actually able to go in real time and update that risk assessment and risk management activities that you've conducted. If you had something that resulted in a harm or changes the probability of occurrence, you should have the opportunity to go in and in real time make that change in your risk management file. The trouble is most people bury the risk management file in a file cabinet once they launch their product into the market, and that the people who are responsible for post-production don't have the skills or the training on keeping risk management activities up to date and current. So the best option is to make sure that your file is living and always represents the current version of your product.
Nicole asks, do we need rationale for our risk acceptance, and how do we document it?
I didn't hear the one word.
Do we need rationale for our risk acceptance, and how do we document it?
Rationale for risk acceptance. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the world is already moving, whether they have products in Europe or not. A lot of people are moving towards some of the concepts that are in the EN 2012 version of 14971. And with that, there's this expectation that you have risk controls identified for everything. And a big part of what the standard defines is basically making sure that you verified the effectiveness of your risk control. So as far as documenting your rationale, really that's what risk controls are about. And if you're in that 2012 environment, let's say, the expectation is that you have a risk control for every single item, every single risk. So if you use that mentality or that approach, then in effect you do have rationale documented for all of your risks.
Jan asks, does product disposal fit into the risk management strategy? Trash can be a major issue in Europe.
Yeah, that's a really good question too. I mean, there's an expectation that you have defined the entire product, what happens during the entire product life cycle, and that also includes what happens when it gets thrown in the garbage. I mean, whether it's a disposable single-use product, you need to think about, is that going to be thrown into a landfill somewhere, and is it going to have toxic leachables that are released into the ground and into the environment? So those are actually things that should be incorporated as part of your risk management activities.
Cecilia asks, what are the usual job titles for those who work in risk management in the ISO 14971 standpoint?
I don't know if there's an actual job title per se. I mean, sometimes there are people who have the title of, quote, risk manager, but but I think it's important to realize that risk is not one single person within the organization's responsibility. It is an enterprise-wide responsibility. If you do have somebody that is given the title of risk manager or given that responsibility, realize that they really should be a facilitator more than anything else, that everyone in your organization plays a part in the risk management process.
Good answer. Mr. Shah asks, the challenge for software failing as it relates to probability is it either fails or it doesn't, bug or no bug. So how do you determine a probability scale for software?
Yeah, I mean, that's again, a pretty specific question. I'd have to know a lot more about the intended use of that particular product and what are the possible failures that could result, what kind of harms could result, and so on, to be able to better advise that. So, Joe, if you want to let him know that he can reach out to me directly, that'd be great.
He can certainly do that. Simon asks, how do you verify the risk control measure works?
Well, I mean, that's all of these things are always challenging, of course, but as far as verifying your risk controls, what you have to do is be able to have objective evidence to be able to support your decision. Once you've implemented a risk control measure, then really the next piece after that is about identifying or reevaluating the residual risk. So you need to reevaluate severity. Usually severity doesn't change unless you've done something to redesign and completely mitigate that out of the equation. Usually what you're impacting is the probability piece from a risk control standpoint. So you should have supporting rationale and objective evidence to be able to back into your justification for your ratings. It's not always easy, and it's sometimes hard based on sample size and so on and so forth. But it's really, that's why it's important to have this to be a team activity and to back into as much objective evidence as you can.
For Khalid, no, I don't think John can talk any slower, but we will have a transcript. So as long as my transcriptionist can understand him, you will be able to read what he said later. Sorry about that. Mark says, could you please define hazard versus failure modes at FMEA?
Well, I can define hazard pretty well because it's in 14971. Hazard is a potential source of harm. I don't have all the definitions in 14971 memorized, but I don't remember failure mode being defined in 14971. You'd have to look into a specific FMEA type of text to define that. But in my experience, failure mode means something broke or something failed. The name is actually pretty descriptive.
Elliot says, you mentioned that FMEA is only a tool and does not fully address performing a risk assessment. What should we use in its place?
Elliot, that's a great question. First and foremost, if you're still on the screen, you can see there's a link to greenlight.guru/risk-webinar-offer. I would encourage you first to go there and to request the demo of the Greenlight software, because we have designed a workflow that aligns with 14971, and it's much about what I talked about today, where there's just a natural progression: hazard, foreseeable events, hazardous situation, harm, estimating severity, estimating probability, identifying risk controls. Yeah, sorry, Khalid, I'm talking really fast, but I got a lot to offer, and I want you to take advantage of this time and this great opportunity that we have at greenlight.guru. But Elliot, I would encourage you to at least check out that demo, and you're going to have access to these slides today and after the webinar, so you'll have an opportunity to kind of see a workflow that I recommend you put in place from your risk management standpoint.
I'll ask patience of the group. Apparently sending 300 and some odd people to get the slides at the same time is something my server was not anticipating. So if it's spinning a little bit, it'll be better soon. Marcus, my friend, is here, and he asks you, do you have experience with software-based solutions for documentation of risk management, such as QAR in Germany? Do these solutions cover all of the requirements of 14971? And an aside, you'll have a chance, John, to meet Marcus at 10X. He's already signed up.
Oh, awesome. Cool. Well, Marcus, I don't know what QARs is, or the name is not something I'm familiar with. I do know this. There's only one software solution that aligns with 14971, and that is greenlight.guru.
Okay. Anne asks, can you address how contract manufacturers are affected by this, and how should they approach risk?
Yeah, I think that's important. That's a really good question, Anne. Contract manufacturers, at least here in the U.S., most definitely have to register with the FDA as such, and that theoretically means that you're subject to possible FDA inspection. If you're outside the world, there are similar ramifications. Generally, outside the U.S., the contract manufacturers will pursue either 9001 or 1345 certification. I suspect today that's going to make the most sense, especially if you're a contract manufacturer in the medical world, to definitely have the 1345 certification in place. But because of that, if you're FDA registered, you're subject to inspection by FDA. FDA is going to expect that you have risk management documented and defined. Now, it may not be from the product standpoint because your name doesn't go on the finished product labels for those particular devices, but you should have the manufacturing processes. You should have risk management activities identified for those things. And if you're in the 1345 world, we already hit on briefly today that standard is evolving too to being a risk-based QMS approach. So if you're certified to 1345, the expectation is that you're also going to need to incorporate risk management throughout your entire quality management system.
Okay, my friend Jim's back with a question. For 1345 201X, you stated the entire QMS should involve risk-based approaches to the QMS process. Could you give an example or a walkthrough of a risk-based approach to a QMS process, perhaps to a simple process like control of documents or control of records?
That's a pretty specific example, and it's a pretty detailed request, actually. I mean, the 1345 standard.
Maybe if you can do a top line and then follow up with Jim directly.
Make sure that your processes from your quality management system, you've identified risk-based approaches. So in the example that was asked for on document control, some examples of areas where risk-based approach is important is what happens to your documents. Where are they stored? Where are they kept? Where are they maintained? Who has reviewed and approved those documents? How do you manage revision history and all those sorts of things? So in a lot of respects, if you're following good documentation practices and you're following the definitions on 1345 for document control and record management, and also FDA, there's a good chance you probably already have many of those risk-based approaches defined. But you have to think about things like disaster recovery and what happens if documents are missing, or you find out during an audit that there's a missing signature. I mean, those are all risks from a compliance standpoint that you need to define what you're doing about that.
Importantly, people did weigh in on the beard question. We have big beard rocks, big beard, small beard, no beard. Where are the women? Small beard. I like John with the big beard better. So I don't know that we have any kind of consensus there. I guess you're going to be kind of left to your own risk
maybe I'll
management.
Just shave half my face.
I think that there's a risk management element about having that much facial hair. I don't know if you want to address that in this conversation.
Well, Joe, I don't have any hair on top of my head, so I think it balances out.
Fair enough. Hans wants to know, risks should be reduced to levels as low as possible, not as low as reasonable. Does that mean risks should be reduced to unreasonable levels?
This is where the two versions of the standard are different. I mean, the 2007 says as low as reasonably practical. The 2012 version says as low as possible or as far as possible. I've seen both of those used almost interchangeably. I don't. That's a really loaded question. I mean, there are some people who have argued that very topic and have said that as far as possible is impractical and unreasonable, and that's really something that is it's very difficult to put in practice. How can you possibly reduce everything as far as possible? And that's one of the, like I said, the contentious points of that particular detail in the ZNX in the 2012 version. And plenty of people are arguing that very topic right now, and I don't have a sound, yes, this is the answer for that particular topic.
Okay. Linda asks, we are a contract manufacturer that does not design product. We manufacture to customer specifications and finished medical devices and are ISO 1345 and FDA registered. How do we define intended use and harm hazards for the products we manufacture?
Okay. Well, I mean, we all still play a part in the risk equation, whether I'm a designer or a manufacturer or what have you. If I'm a contract manufacturer, there's probably a good chance that somebody has provided me with a product design somewhere along the way. So as part of that process, then I need to be aware of what that product intended use is and how it's designed and so on. Not so much from a design standpoint, but to make sure that as I'm manufacturing it, I'm not introducing hazards as part of my manufacturing process that can negatively impact the intended use.
Next question. Susan asks, is there a risk management for dummies out there to help groups go step by step through their first process?
Susan, yes. Send me an email. I'll get it to you.
John, let me write that out. Is it John at or John?
It's on screen. It's on screen right now. Jon, Jon, period, Speer.
There, I just sent it as a link to
at greenlight.guru.
To folks.
Yeah, Joe, we're coming out with the complete guide to risk management in about a week or so. So tell Linda she's not a dummy, but we'll get her the complete guide.
Okay. I remember reading someone asking if your system is validated. Is your software validated? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Rich said that his software question is so big that I think he needs to follow up with you directly. So look for
okay, that's fine.
A note from Rich. Khalid asks, can we use information from human factors and usability evaluations to define our risk acceptability criteria?
Oh, absolutely. It's a really good idea. And those activities could also be used potentially as risk controls as well.
Richard asks, is there a hard copy template for assessing and resolving risk?
I guess, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what that means. But
I'm not sure either. I hope you did. Richard, if you'd like to send a follow-up note, I'll read it aloud. Joe, I'm sorry I have to leave. John, that was great. Okay. Another vote for Big Beard. Good. Jim writes, I disagree with your marketing pitch, but QWare from Germany is fully integrated with EN 14971. So
yeah, I'm not aware. I haven't heard of QAR, and I don't know anybody that uses it. So, like I said, Greenlight is the only software solution that aligns with ISO 14971 2007 and EN ISO 14971 2012, and fully integrates design control activities with your risk management. And that I am for certain.
Rich asks, I understand that FMEA alone is not sufficient for risk management, but as the pardon me, but is the combination of hazards analysis, DFMEA, and PFMEA sufficient to satisfy the requirements of analysis, evaluation, and control? If not, what other tools are needed?
Yeah, I'd have to look at Rich's process to understand exactly whether or not that would work. I mean, there's a possibility, yes, but sometimes people say FMEA and they don't always mean the same thing as the next person that says FMEA. So I would say, without knowing specific details, then there's a possibility, of course.
Okay, as people leave, they're giving their final votes. We have Big Beard is sexier and Big Beard for John. That's okay. For you.
I can sign 8x10s if anybody wants one.
What's that?
I can sign an 8x10 picture with a big beard.
Glossies are included with for all webinar participants. Okay. In what way is ISO 9001:2015 and the new 1345-201X not aligned from ULF?
Aligned or not aligned?
In what ways are they not aligned?
Yeah, they used to be in complete alignment, but 9001 is for general manufacturing. And 1345, when it was introduced several years ago, was specific to med device. And now that 9001 has been revised, they both have incorporated more risk-based terminology and approaches as far as concerned. But they just had hit a fork in the road. Again, 9001 is for general manufacturing. It is not for med device. And 1345 is for med device. So I would say the biggest area where they're not in alignment is just that piece alone. Secondly, 1345 is moving towards better alignment with the regulatory environment in the med device industry.
Okay, I'll stop us in 12 minutes at the half hour, and if you answer in short spurts, we may be able to get through these questions. Mr. Jane asks, what does the risk/harm definition consist of? Only safety injury, or should it also contain non-injury product risks? Yeah,
I mean, harm can be certainly include injury or some sort of adverse event or something like that, but it can also incorporate nuisance. It can also incorporate things like damage to equipment and things along those lines. So it doesn't always have to be just an injury type of descriptor.
You may have answered this, but for Terry, what is the best way to evaluate overall residual risk based on risk levels of all risks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you would have a similar risk acceptability scale that you would have defined for your severity and your probability. And when you look at the overall product, you're basically using that same acceptability scale for that overall product. But you would look at it in aggregate. You wouldn't slice it at the individual hazard level. You would look at the product in its entirety and determine, from an overall standpoint, is that product safe? Is it effective? Do the medical benefits outweigh the risk? And are your levels at a point where your management and your executive powers within your company accept the risks that are applicable to your product?
Nick, I can hear you typing. Gordon from Montreal asks, are including warnings in the IFU an acceptable risk control?
Well, it depends. You said Gordon. Where's Gordon based?
He's in Montreal, Canada.
Montreal, Canada. So if Gordon's following the 2007 version of the standard, there is an expectation that you can use labeling as an effective risk control. This is an area where 2012 version indicates that labeling is not accepted as really a risk control measure. First and foremost, it has to be inherent by design and safety measures incorporated into the product. The expectation is that labeling is part and parcel with designing, developing, and manufacturing a medical device. So if that information is contained on your product label and your instructions for use, it should have been there anyway. It shouldn't be a way to reduce risk.
Scott asks, with respect to harms, how do you deal with questions about misuse, especially as we have human factors requirements about that? Pointing at training materials isn't always a good answer in an audit. Your ideas?
Yeah, misuse is a tricky topic. The ISO 14971 does address and deal with foreseeable misuse. That you should identify hazards that are associated with that for sure. But as far as like intention, there's two different types of misuse. There's intentional and unintentional misuse. But you really need to identify the hazards that are associated with misuse of your product. And this is a case, again, where, as noted, the human factors could be strong supporting evidence to be able to show from a risk control standpoint that your product has effectively dealt with that.
Marcella asks, can a risk control measure be a test? She writes parenthetically, part of the design verification, or the risk controls are implemented in the design, software, labeling, training, and the testing is only to verify the implementation of the controls.
I suppose both scenarios are, I mean, that's a pretty specific example. I suppose both scenarios have potential. Like I mentioned earlier, generally risk controls are things like, direct tie-ins to your design controls, things like design outputs, design verification, design validation. And I think it's a pretty specific example. I suppose either scenario mentioned could work from a risk control.
Mark wants to know if there's a preliminary draft of the new ISO 1345 available somewhere. If you
I think there is. I don't have it. I think I saw that on like BSI's website.
Okay.
If you search for, I think it's called D as in dog, IS 1345. I may say 201X. I can't remember exactly. But if you just do a search on the internet for that, you can find that. I think you have to pay for it, though. So if you have a notified body or a registrar that you're working with right now, you may connect with them and see if they can provide that draft to you.
And Mark, we'll have notified body TUVSUD on this time next week talking about the new CE marking rules. I would be surprised if they don't have a copy of it. Luis asks, how will the new ISO 1345201X affect silicone components manufacturers? Perhaps too specific for you to know on the spot.
I do not know.
Okay, follow up with Luis. Jason wants to know, do you have any insight on new industry testing standards in regards to ISO 10993 biocompatibility and leachable, extractable risk evaluations?
Tell Jason I do not have the specific insights on 10993, but I know 3 experts who do. If he wants to reach out, I'll be happy to make a connection.
That sounds reasonable, so Jason, please email John. Andy wants to know, can you point out any differences in risk management processes as described for 1345 versus the new 9001-2015 revisions? We might have asked that question, but if you could recap that quickly.
I'll give a slightly different answer this time. How's that?
Okay.
I have always focused on 1345. I don't have all the ins and outs of 9001. I've been very focused on med device topics, so I don't have the specific details of where they're different. I can just tell you that 1345 is shifting to better align with med device industry best practices and regulatory environment.
Okay. What methodology have you seen to address risk-benefit analysis for individual residual risks?
It depends on what the particular item is. Generally, if you have some supporting evidence, some sort of test or some sort of analysis, or maybe you can use market research and so on. There's a lot of different tools and techniques that can be used to support your medical benefits outweigh your risk. I mean, there's no way I can be specific enough to address that exact question, but testing works, market research works. There's a lot of other ways that also are acceptable.
We have been asking if Jon has done a thorough risk assessment of his beard. And he thinks that you will find out that no beard is much safer, thus a lower risk. While Keith Anderson, on the other hand, throws caution to the wind and advises you to stick with the big beard. Let's see.
Yeah, it's about to be wintertime here in the next few months. I need to keep my face warm.
Okay. Well, that's something right there. Does your software also include a post-market surveillance review model to check if the initial risk profile is seen when commercialized?
The short answer is yes. We allow the risk management file to be a living entity throughout the entire product lifecycle. Yeah, I mean, you can click the link or go to the link that's on the screen to schedule a demo to learn more about how that works.
If risk is the probability plus severity of harm, how does record retention or document control weigh in?
Okay, I was thinking about the context of that. That's probably back to the earlier question. But using a ISO 14971 as the backbone from a risk standpoint within your quality system, and we think about probability occurrence of harm and severity of a harm being the definition of risk. If you look at it from a doc control standpoint, what's the probability? I'll give you one example. What's the probability that a critical record in your system is missing a signature? And if that's the case, what is the severity of that? Are you going to get 43 observation from FDA? Are you going to get a nonconformance from ISO? So those are factors that you can throw in as far as doc control and concepts of risk.
Jack wants to know in what stadium your basketball photo was taken.
That's in Bankers Life Fieldhouse in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Let's see. Great webinar. Okay. Slides leaving. It's a beautiful day. Okay. Well, we're at I think there's maybe a half dozen questions I wasn't able to get to, but Jon and company, you'll have a record of all the questions that were asked. And on behalf of those who tuned in today, please make a point of answering them individually if you can.
Yeah, we'll do, Joe. Thank you.
Final thoughts after 90 minutes from me. First, thank you. This was very informative. I know it is when 200 people are still around at the 90-minute mark. So thank you very much. This is very informative. I will have a transcript made up. I will have the video online later today. And I am on with my host right now to reset my server. So folks try again in about 5 minutes for the slides, and I will send out an email in perhaps an hour's time with the link to the video as well. Jon, I'll see you in person in May at the 10X conference. Looking forward to shaking your hand, and as I'm sure most people on the call are, I'll be curious to see what kind of facial hair you'll be sporting.
All right. Great, Joe.
Thank you, everyone. And tune in next week for CE Mark with TUV SUD. Thank you, Jon and company. Bye for now.